In the Rue Pigalle by George Simenon, in the Maigret saga, was fiddling with his bottles behind the bar, decanting, recorking, carefully changing the washer on his tap, and his sullenness might well have been put down to the time of day and the weather. For it was a grey morning, colder than usual, the sort of morning when snow seems imminent and you want to stay in bed. It was barely 9 o'clock, and there was little activity in the Rue Pigalle. The casual visitor would probably have wondered about the identity of the thick-set man in a heavy overcoat who stood with his back to the stove, smoking a pipe and nursing a glass of spirits in his hand. He would certainly not have expected to find here Superintendent Maigret of the police judiciaire. He would also have seen a slatternly Breton servant girl, Julie, with a permanently scared look on her freckled face, kneeling on the floor and wiping the legs of the table. In the restaurants of the Pigalle district, things seldom start very early. The place had not been cleaned, dirty glasses were still lying around, and in the kitchen, through the open door, the patronne, Marina herself, could be seen, looking even grubbier and more ungainly than her maid. The general effect was quiet and homely. At the farthest table, there were two men who, although they were unshaven and their rumpled suits had clearly been slept in, didn't look in too bad shape. In fact, the casual visitor would just have thought the place a modest restaurant like any other, with its regular customers, a place not of the cleanest, to be sure, but not unattractive on this chilly morning. He would doubtless have changed his mind on seeing Maigret suddenly glance at the camel-hair overcoat belonging to one of the customers and hanging on the coat rack, go up to it, thrust his hand into the pockets and pull out a knuckle-duster, and then, on hearing the superintendent remark good-humouredly, "Hey, Christiani, is this the one that knocked me out?" Half an hour earlier, on his arrival at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret had been called to the phone by somebody who insisted on speaking to him personally and who was obviously making an effort to disguise his voice. "That you, Superintendent? Look here, there was a row going on last night at Marina's. If you were to look in there, you might meet your old friend Christiani, and it might occur to you to ask him for news of Martino. You know, the kid from Antibes, whose brother has just been shipped off to Guyana." Before 5 minutes were up, Maigret had learnt from the exchange that the telephone call came from a tobacconist's in the Rue Notre-Dame-de-Lorette. A quarter of an hour later, he alighted from a taxi at the corner of the Rue Pigalle, just as the gutters were carrying their fullest load of refuse alongside the pavement. Although he was still in the dark, Maigret was convinced that the affair must be taken seriously, indeed very seriously, since such denunciations are seldom unfounded. He had the proof of this right away, as he walked slowly up the street. Almost opposite Marina's, he noticed a small bar, kept by an Auvergnat, unexpectedly wedged between two nightclubs. In this bar, keeping watch close to the window, the superintendent recognized two men, the Niçois and Pepito, who are not usually seen about so early, particularly in such a place. The minute after, he pushed open the door of the restaurant across the street, at the far end of which he saw Christiani with a young recruit, René Lecoeur, known as the accountant, because he had formerly been a bank clerk in Marseille. In this sort of situation, it is better not to be surprised at anything. Raising his hand to his bowler hat, Maigret greeted the assembled company like any harmless regular dropping in for a drink. "How goes it, Lucien?" Which did not prevent him from noticing the way the napkin shook in Lucien's hands, while the maid, looking up with a start, bumped her head against a table. "Did you have a lot of company last night? Give me a coffee and a small calvados." Then, entering the kitchen, "How are things, Marina? I saw you'd had a mirror broken above the bar." For he had noticed at a glance that a mirror had been smashed by a bullet from a revolver. "That was done some time ago," Lucien hurriedly explained. "Somebody I don't know who had just bought a gun and didn't know it was loaded." After that, things moved very slowly. Maigret had been there for over a quarter of an hour, and they had not exchanged more than a score of remarks. The maid went on with her work, Lucien remained behind the bar, and Marina busied herself in the kitchen. Meanwhile, the superintendent smoked his pipe and drank his calvados, going from time to glance out at the bistro over the way, and then returning to stand by the stove. He knew the household like the back of his hand. Lucien, who had been in trouble in Marseille, had subsequently gone straight and opened this little restaurant in Montmartre with his wife. His customers were chiefly old acquaintances, people from the underworld, of course, but who had settled down, for the most part, and become almost respectable. This was the case with Christiani, who, 10 years previously when arrested, had promptly struck Maigret with his knuckle-duster, and who was now owner of a couple of houses in Paris and another at Barcelonnette. It was more or less the case, too, with the men in the bistro over the way, particularly the Niçois, who also owned houses like Christiani's and unfortunately in competition with his. "Say, how long has your pal been staying at the Auvergnats across the street? I'm not interested in such people," retorted Christiani with contempt. "That may be. But he certainly seems to be interested in you, and if I didn't know you're a stout fellow, I'd think that it's his presence in the little bistro that keeps you from going out." A pause and another sip of Calvados. "Yes. That's how I'd picture things. Last night, for one reason or another, there could have been some unpleasantness, and since then, Pepito and the Niçois could have been waiting for you outside, so that the two of you had to sleep on the restaurant benches." As he spoke, he went up to the accountant and fingered the creases on the young man's jacket. "Only I wonder what could have happened, seeing that everyone knows Lucien doesn't like trouble, and that you're no longer the sort to take risks. By the way, Martino's brother, who set off yesterday from the Ile de Ré, sends you his greetings." All very friendly, almost good-humoured. Nevertheless, Christiani had given a start, and since the accountant was standing there, Maigret took the opportunity to feel his pockets and extract a stout knife with a safety catch. "That's dangerous, son. You shouldn't go about carrying that kind of toy. What about you, Christiani? Haven't you anything for me in your pockets?" Christiani, with a shrug, pulled out a Smith & Wesson revolver, which he handed over to the superintendent. "Why, hello, there's one bullet missing, maybe the one that smashed the mirror. What surprises me, by the way, is that you didn't reload it, and that you didn't bother to clean the barrel." He slipped the knife, the knuckle-duster and the revolver into his overcoat pocket, and with apparent unconcern searched in every corner of the place, even opening the ice-box and the telephone booth. Meanwhile, his mind was hard at work. He was trying to understand. He built up hypotheses, which he rejected one after the other. Did you know that the Niçois told Martino that someone had informed on his brother? At any rate, that's the story I've just heard. If I let you go, it's so that you may avoid him, for he might hold it against you, and he generally carries a gun." "What are you getting at?" growled Christiani, who to all appearances was just as calm as Maigret. "Nothing. I'd like to see Martino. I don't know why, but I'd be interested to see him." Meanwhile, he had made sure that nobody, alive or dead, was hidden in the restaurant, or in the kitchen, or in the adjoining bedroom, where Lucien and Marina slept. At 9:30, a messenger brought in a case of apéritifs, and then, almost immediately afterwards, a huge yellow van belonging to the Voyageurs du Chemin agency stopped in front of the building, leaving again shortly after. "I'd like a slice of sausage, Marina. One of your own make?" Then Maigret gave a sudden frown on seeing a new figure emerge from the bedroom, looking as surprised as himself. "Where have you come from?" I was lying on the bed." It was Fred, who had been Christiani's accomplice on various occasions. He was lying, since Maigret had just ascertained that the bedroom was empty. "It seems to me," muttered the superintendent, "that you're all so fond of the house that you won't leave it." You give me your gun, too." Fred hesitated, then held out his revolver, another Smith & Wesson, from which no cartridge was missing. "Will you give it me back?" "Maybe. It depends on what Martino has to tell me. I'm expecting him at any moment. Yes, I told him to meet me here." He was watching their faces, and he saw René Lecoeur turn pale and gulp down a mouthful of spirits. Maigret made one more effort. He had to find the answer at all costs, and he found it just as he was looking out into the street, where a lorry was passing. "Lift the receiver," he ordered Christiani. He did not want to go into the phone booth himself, for that would have meant taking his eye off his suspects. "Ask for police headquarters. Get Lucas on the line. You've got him? Pass me the receiver." Fortunately, the cord was long enough. "That you, Lucas? Ring up the Voyager Duchemin agency right away. We must get hold of a van of theirs which has just delivered or collected something in the Rue Pigalle. Understood? Find out what it was. Quick as you can. Yes, I'm stopping here." Then, turning towards the kitchen, "What about that sausage, Marina?" "Coming, Superintendent. Here you are. I don't expect these gentlemen want any. Unless I'm very much mistaken, they can't be feeling very hungry." At 10 minutes past 11, they were all still in their places, including the Niçois and his companion at the Auvergnats over the way. At 11 minutes past 11, Lucas jumped out of a taxi in a state of great excitement, pushed open the door and signaled to Maigret that he had something important to tell him. "You can speak in front of these gentlemen. They're all friends." "I got hold of the van in the Boulevard Rochechouart. They collected a trunk. They'd had a phone call from this house. A third-floor tenant, Monsieur Bechevel. It was a huge trunk, or rather a chest, to be sent by goods train to Quimper." "You let it go, I hope," teased Maigret. "I had it opened. There was a body in it. Martino's. The man whose brother—" "I know. And then Dr. Paul was at home, and he came round right away. I've got the bullet, which was still embedded in the wound." Maigret fingered it nonchalantly, and muttered as though to himself, "A Browning. 6 mm 35. You see how it is. These gentlemen who spent the night here only have Smith & Wessons. Nobody could foresee what he was going to do. Even now, a casual visitor would not have realized the tenseness of the situation. Lucien was exercising all his ingenuity finding things to do behind the bar. Shall I tell you what I think happened? Strictly between ourselves, of course. Last night Martino, who'd had too much to drink, got it into his head that Christiani was responsible for his brother's arrest. He came to settle accounts with him. And then, as he was a bit overexcited, he had an accident. You get my meaning? Lucas, too, was wondering what his chief was getting at. Christiani had lit a cigarette and was blowing out the smoke with assumed indifference. Only the Niçois and Pepito were waiting in the street. They dared not come in, but they thought they'd wait for the others outside. Are you with me now? That's why these friends of ours slept on the restaurant benches while the Niçois kept watch outside, and then, at daybreak, settled down at the Auvergnats. The trickiest part was what to do with that wretched corpse. They couldn't really leave it on Lucien's hands. What would you have done, Christiani? You're an intelligent fellow. Christiani gave a disdainful shrug. You tell me, Lucien. Who's this Bechevel on the 3rd floor? An old gentleman, an invalid. Just what I thought. Someone went up there in the small hours and made it clear to him that he'd got to keep quiet. Before anyone was awake in the house, they took the body up there by the back stairs and put it into a chest belonging to the old man. Then they rang up the Voyageurs du Chemin. Go up to the 3rd floor and see if I'm right. I'm sure you'll be given the description of our friend Fred, who was in charge of the job. So far, there was nothing sensational about the scene. In fact, a bank messenger who had called was able to settle his business, with Lucien without noticing anything untoward. You've still got nothing to tell me, Christiani. Nothing. And you, Lecoeur. After all, it's the first time I've seen you involved in serious trouble. I don't know what you're talking about, the boy said in a tense voice. Then we shall just have to wait for Lucas. They waited. and the other lot across the street waited too. And the street grew busier, while the clouds lifted a little and the light became brighter. Too bad it had to happen here, Lucien. Never let anyone break a mirror. It brings bad luck. Lucas was soon back, announcing, "You were quite right. I found the poor fellow bound and gagged. He described Fred, but there was somebody else there last night whom he didn't see. They jumped on him while he was still asleep. That'll do. Ring for a taxi. Wait. Call headquarters too, and get them to send somebody to watch the fellows over the way, and see that they don't make trouble." Maigret, scratching his head, looked at his 3 toughs and said with a sigh, "In the meantime, perhaps we shall find out which of you fired the shot." As if he had all the time in the world and didn't know how to spend it, Maigret selected one of the tables and spread out on it a regular panoply of weapons, setting Christiani's knuckle-duster by the side of his revolver and Fred's, then putting Lecoeur's knife a little further off. "Don't panic about what I'm going to tell you, kid," he said to the young man, who seemed about to faint. "This is the first time you've been in trouble, but it probably won't be the last. This gun, you see, undoubtedly belongs to Christiani, who's been too long in the business to play about with a little Browning like the one that killed Martino. Fred, too, is an old hand who likes serious weapons. When the row broke out, Christiani fired and someone must have knocked his arm, for he only hit the mirror. Then you, with your little Browning—" "I haven't got a Browning," the accountant managed to stammer out. "Exactly. It's the fact that you haven't got one that proves you fired the shot. Fred kept his gun because he knew it would prove his innocence. Christiani didn't even clean his, to show that he had only fired one shot which hit nobody. They both know all about experts' reports, and they played the game accordingly, whereas you had to get rid of your revolver because it would have proved you were the murderer. Where did you put it?" "I didn't kill him." "I'm asking you where you put it." "Ask Christiani. It's too late to play the clever boy." "You won't find any Browning." Maigret looked at him with pity and muttered under his breath, "You poor sucker." The more of a sucker, the more to be pitied, since Martino had borne him no grudge, and he had only fired to prove to the others that he had guts. When Lucas returned, Maigret whispered to him, "Look everywhere, especially on the roof. They won't have been such fools as to hide the gun in Lucien's place or in the old man's. See if at the top of the stairs there's a window opening onto the roof." He took his lot with him, while 2 or 3 harmless-looking strollers kept watch on the bistro across the street. Christiani, in his camel-hair overcoat, looked like some respectable citizen who has been arrested by mistake, and who will promptly be released with apologies. Fred had assumed a jaunty air. The accountant was tense in every nerve. The case was an absolutely classic one. Maigret had always claimed that, but for chance, 50% of criminals would escape punishment, and that, but for informers, another 50% would remain at liberty. It sounded like a wisecrack, particularly when uttered in his cheerful, gruff voice. All the same, an informer had played a part here, and so had chance, which had enabled him to notice the yellow van of the Voyageur du Chemin. But was there not also a considerable factor due to professional skill, knowledge of human nature, and even what is known as flair? At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Browning was discovered on the roof, where it had been thrown through the skylight. At 3:30, the accountant had confessed with tears, while Christiani, giving the address of a celebrated lawyer, asserted, "You'll see, it'll get me about 6 months." At which Maigret sighed, without looking at him. "And your knuckle-duster only cost me a couple of teeth."